What is going on, guys? Jeff here, Mad Hatter's Reef. Today we're going to be taking a look at the diamond bandsaw from Gryphon. But before we jump into anything, if this is your first time being here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell so you can be notified every single time that we upload a new video. All right, let's jump into it. So, not too long ago, the old saw gave up on us. And being a fish store, it makes it kind of hard to frag if you don't have a saw. We did, however, buy a Dremel, and if you wanted to see a video on how not to frag corals with a Dremel, we could have done that for you because it got messy. It got really messy. And being somebody that has a beard, it's kind of gross. A little bit of a mess. A little bit of a mess. But anyways, we have put the Dremel away and have retired the island bandsaw, and now we have moved on to the Gryphon. And I was pleasantly surprised as to how easy it was to put this guy together, and we're going to go over all of that here in this video. Not that this is like a true step-by-step guide of setting it up, but we are going to talk through some of the things that I learned while setting it up. This is a very well thought out saw for cutting coral. Now, if you're wondering which model we went with, this is the 42-inch C40 Gryphon AquaSaw. This is the XL. It's a little bit more pricey than the base model, but I figured if I'm going to be cutting coral, I wanted to have a little bit more headway to be able to get some larger pieces in there, and that's why I went with this one. Some folks that may be researching this saw have found the 37-inch. Obviously, that isn't how tall it is. That's in reference to the length of the blade. And that is a little bit smaller, but for 50 bucks, I figured it was better to go with the XL. Now, as far as the specs go with this saw, it's relatively lackluster as far as the information that you'll find out there. It's pretty easy to put together. There were some questions that I had as I went through and put it together, and we'll kind of talk about some of those as we go along here. I did find assembling it, outside of you watching me struggle right here, I did find it relatively intuitive, which made it pretty easy to put together without getting too far into the weeds with the instructions. Although I'm always going to recommend that you guys check out the instructions before you put stuff together, especially something like a saw. There's no belts or pulleys, which makes it relatively easy to put together. One thing I did kind of question as I was putting the head unit onto the saw was the motion of the saw. It has like a little bit of a wobble, and that wobble is built into it to be able to adjust the saw blade, which I found out when I went along a little bit further. The two metal inserts slide into the bottom, and then it stays in place. You have the ability to adjust the overall height of the motor with a nylon screw that's underneath, and literally all that does is just sit on the plastic, and then you screw the nylon nut or bolt, and then it will rise slowly, and that's basically how you go about putting on the saw blade. Did come with two sponges that we installed, as you can see here. One of them went underneath the bottom wheel, and then the other one was a little bit of a guide for the saw blade, which sits in the back. And they really aren't going to hold up for very long, so you're going to need more sponges. The actual instructions say just go to the grocery store and buy sponges, so keep that in mind. As far as the guide that goes onto the right next to the motor, that was a little bit tricky to get that figured out how that sat in there, but ultimately we figured it out and got it in place. It does have nylon inserts that go into the guide, which is in direct contact with the saw blade, and they give you a couple extra in a little Ziploc baggie, so once those start to wear down, you can get those replaced. As far as unwinding the saw blade, as you can see here, I'm struggling a little bit with that, but if you have to force it, you're definitely not doing it right, so I ended up closing it back up and then trying it a different way, and as you can see, it popped right open, and then we're able to start the install process of the blade. Now, as far as installing the blade, it's relatively simple. Wasn't nearly as painful as my experience with the island bandsaw. They recommend starting on the bottom wheel and then bringing it to the top wheel, and that's where that bolt in the back to be able to adjust the overall head comes into play. You may need to drop it down a little bit so you actually can get the blade onto the top wheel. They say to start at the 9 o'clock position on the top wheel and then slowly feed it onto that wheel. Once you have the blade in place, you can make adjustments with that bolt in the back to tighten up the blade a little bit. You don't want to over tighten because you could potentially break your blade, but it definitely was a little bit tricky at first, but after doing it for a few minutes, kind of got a feel for it. And having experience with a coral saw in the past, and it being incredibly painful to get that blade on there, this was pretty refreshing as far as how easy it was. I think the hardest part about getting the blade on the wheels was getting them into the guides. That's about it. So at this point, all I'm doing is just making sure that the blade is in position and I'm having it run the way in which that I want it to. They say in the instructions to make sure that you're walking it back to the back of the wheel, which if you were looking at it from my perspective, you can actually see that bottom wheel has a little bit of a tilt to it. And that probably has a lot to do with the way that that motor is designed to wobble. And I had mentioned earlier in the video where I was actually kind of worried that it was broken. Just right off the bat, I'm like, oh, great, here we go. It's broken. But after, making these adjustments, you can actually see the wheel start to change position. Well, not the wheel, the motor change position once you get the blade into place and then start making those small adjustments to that nylon bolt in the back. And then you actually can see that motor moving just slightly the way in which it is designed to wobble. Now that the blade is in place, it's time to button this little saw up. As far as this motor cover, it's meant to slide in from the top, not go face forward like I had started there for a second, but clicks into place and makes for pretty easy removal. Also, the plate for the saw itself, again, pretty robust and also clicks into place and is a pretty good working surface for cutting up coral. When it comes to actually fragging corals with the saw, the instructions recommend using saltwater. And that's good, that's fine. Instructions are instructions. And basically I thought I was going to be clever and use RO water instead because it'd be much cleaner. Obviously there's a good amount of dust that is getting thrown around when you are using the saw, and you need to use one liquid to make sure that it's just not going everywhere. Hence also another issue with using a Dremel. But I opted for RO, and then after this run, on the next run went to saltwater because it does splatter quite a bit. And if you have a coral that is on the saw that is getting cut up and there's a bunch of fresh water getting thrown all over it, I think you're just adding to the overall stress of the coral getting fragged. So I will, going forward, be using salt water, even though that's probably going to add a little bit more to the overall maintenance of the saw. As far as the instructions go with the fill up of the bottom well, it says to have the water level just below that sponge on underneath the bottom wheel. Once I got the blade in place with the guides, I turned it on. You can kind of see here some of the splattering that's happening already. This is just straight RO water, and with the coral that I was fragging, I didn't think it was a huge deal because water splashed around a little bit, but if you're cutting like a big chalice, that's probably something to consider because this is a substantial amount of water that's getting thrown around, even though that I have it filled to the way that the directions specify. Another note on the amount of splatter that this guy throws around, there's a substantial amount of spray happening, so you definitely want to make sure that you are not working with your mouth open. You're using safety glasses and also gloves not pictured in this video. Don't be like me. Don't drive angry. One thing that I like to do when I am using a saw as often as I possibly can is use tweezers as well. Anytime that I can get my fingers and bits out of the way of the blade, I'm going to do that. Sometimes I'll even go as far as to use 2 tweezers just to make sure that I am not working with my fingers that close to the blade, because so much of what you're doing when you are fragging corals is just small intricate pieces that you're cutting off, and anything that you can do to protect yourself is definitely going to go a long way in keeping all your digits.